Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Clark from ATI, and thank you for joining part 3 of our webinar series that we're holding in part with our partners at QuickTrack. This is the webinar series to inform you on the upcoming CMMC requirements. So in a minute here, I'll turn it over to Derek from QuickTrack, who will introduce his team, and then they'll take you through this session on segmenting and enclaving. First, though, we do have the videos from the first two portions of the webinar series up on our website, along with the PowerPoint presentation for this session. And I just put that website in the chat for you all. And then as this webinar is going on, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom. So that will most likely be at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. We do ask that you put them in the Q&A instead of the chat. That allows us to save and export those questions for later so that we can address those at a later date. So again, thank you for joining. I'll turn it over to Derek.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Welcome back, everybody who has attended the first couple webinars. And for those of you that this is your first time, my name is Derek White with Beryllium and QuickTrack, and today, if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to kind of do a really brief introduction on our special guest today. So first, we're going to have Jeff Baldwin, who is the Chief Information Security Officer here at Beryllium and QuickTrack. Jeff's got a robust background. You can find that on our website. It's also going to be on this slide to refer back to later. So we're going to get some perspective from his side, from the CISO side, on what that means to organizations trying to go through the challenge of CMMC. And then also we have Heather Engel, who's the managing partner at Strategic Cyber Partners and somebody who's been in the space a long time. We've worked closely with Heather for years with a huge background and really into the details that we're getting to today. So we'll have her follow up after Jeff. And then at the end, we will do some open question, live Q&A, etc. So next slide real quick, just to run through the agenda for today, and then I'm going to kick it over to Jeff. As Chris mentioned, this link is in the chat, so it'll be at the end too on the last slide to see previous and upcoming webinars, the video recordings, the slides, etc. Great landing page, great website for this 6-part series. And so some of the details for Part 4 we'll announce here soon, but more importantly, anything you have questions on, past, present, future of this series, please access that website. So today we're going to focus on the segmenting and enclaving topic. And so we're going to start with some key definitions. There are just some things that get kind of thrown around that we want to make sure that we're very clear on, that help the mind think about segmenting and enclaving versus maybe some other terms that are thrown around, but also kind of retouch a shade on the past part 2, which was more about scoping, but talk today about scoping assets correctly so that you can make the right decision on what is best for your company, on what approach to take, so that we can then talk about enclaving versus other approaches. This is the beauty of a security program, cybersecurity program like this, is that you get to choose what's best for you as long as you meet the requirements. And then from that point, we get to talk about what impacts to the responsibility happen based on the approaches that are in front of you. So enclaving versus others, or different types of enclaving and segmenting, and what that does to the responsibility of you and those that you utilize, so that you can start to balance that out. And then at the end, we'll do free resources like we have for the previous 2, and then do some Q&A. So pretty straightforward stuff here, and I wanted to get through that as fast as possible so I can kick it over to Jeff and Heather and let them get right into it.
Okay, thank you, Derek. So to begin, we'll talk about some of the similarities and differences between network segmentation and enclaves, or enclaving, the noun versus the verb. Segmentation is a term in network management, network engineering, where you can segment your network into subnets. So there's a variety of reasons why you'd want to do that. But once you apply access controls to subnets, then you have logical separation. Because before you do any kind of access control lists or separation, just doing subnetting and segmentation on its own doesn't necessarily provide any kind of security benefit. So once you apply the access control list to that subnets and that segmentation, now you're applying some security impacts to that. Enclave is a little bit more thoroughly done with that separation, with that level of isolation. So they're very similar, but they're not necessarily one for one. So if you look at a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap between segmentation and enclave, but they are not a one for one for each other. So that's just kind of clearing that up first. And then on the next slide, we can actually look at some of the definitions from the NIST glossary. And if you've never used the NIST glossary, it's very useful. Kind of like in contracts, when you have any of these DFARs or FAR clauses, they always start with a definition section. That way everybody's using the same language because words do matter. And if, you see that a lot with acronyms too, where a lot of acronyms and they can mean different things depending on the context. So always important to have some key definitions. For this one, the definitions from an enclave, you have a set of system resources that operate in the same security domain and share the protection of a single continuous security perimeter. So that introduces what is the security domain? Well, security domain is that environmental context that includes those system resources we just talked about, and a set of system entities that have the right to access the resources as defined by a common security policy, security model, or security architecture. So essentially, thinking back to where information resides, information have different protection requirements. If you segment the information into different security domains, you can have different security protection requirements. So you can have a lower security domain and a higher security domain. So going back to the enclave, an enclave has to have a boundary because we have a continuous security perimeter. What do we have at perimeters? We have the boundary, and the boundary sits there to act as the guard gate to let things in and out to that enclave. So we have a perimeter, we have an enclave boundary, that's the perimeter. And then sitting at that boundary, we have a controlled interface. This is usually a firewall, but this is the interface that sits between the internal network and the external network in terms of the enclave. So we have that there. It's providing some sort of control of flow of information between the internal system and the external system. And then the last concept to introduce for this webinar today is a subsystem. So that is, you can take a part of your information system and carve it into a subsystem. So that's just, we'll see this in a later slide, so I wanted to introduce it now. So basically you have an information system, you can take that information system, carve it into subsystems, and when you have that information system, you'd have a system security plan that governs the entire system security plan, including its subsystems. Next slide. So when we get into that carving, what we're really talking about is boundaries and assessment scope. So determining your system boundary is very critical because going back to that concept of a security domain and the protection requirements for each security domain, you can scope things accordingly. So in a perfect world, you would do the most highest level security on everything, everywhere. However, we have limited budgets, limited timelines and schedules. So where we limit the most sensitive information, that's where we put our most protections. And then the less critical information don't necessarily have to be in a higher level security domain. So then we can have a lower security posture for that as kind of a cost benefit analysis and risk management perspective. So with the boundaries and the scoping, that's important. And when we're thinking about scoping, we're thinking about what is included in our system, what's not included in our system, and what is interconnected to our system. So if we are talking about other external systems, those do get identified in CMMC with controls in the access control family and domain, for example, like 3120. But we also want to scope around people, processes, technology, assets. So when we look at the CMMC scoping guides, they talk about scoping your people, your processes, and your assets. So looking at each of the different asset categories in level 2 for CUI scoping for CMMC, there is 5 categories. The first 4 are in assessment scope. The last one is not in assessment scope. So an out of scope asset is an asset that cannot process, store, or transmit CUI. So it's been fully physically or logically separated from CUI. There's no way that it's touching anything CUI at all. So if you have a system like that, you can scope it out completely. Now, the assets that do process, store, transmit CUI, those are known as CUI assets. And then with the CMMC scoping, they introduced the concept of a contractor risk managed asset. So basically, these are things that can process, store, transmit CUI because they have not been physically or logically separated from CUI assets, but they're not intended to do that. So you may put security policy procedures and practices in place. You might have administrative policy say, hey, don't use CUI processing on this asset, but this thing has not been separated from those assets. So talking about the enclaving and the segmentation piece, they have not been fully separated from CUI assets. The next concept they introduce is security protection assets. So these are assets that provide some sort of security functionality or capability to your assessment scope. They can process CUI, they don't necessarily have to, but these are things that are connected to CUI assets and are providing security functionality to your overall system. And then the last one being specialized assets. People are familiar with this, and if you have a manufacturing floor, these are your operational technology things that sit on that technology floor that build your parts. You might have some IoT things in there as well, some sensors, thermostats. And then the other two, well, the other 3 would be the government property. So when you're given government property, you generally don't have access to modify it. Restricted information system is the thing that looks like a fielded system. So you might have a contract where you have to perform troubleshooting or development on a government system. The government system that is fielded is maybe kind of old. It might be running old operating systems, may not be the most secure, but for your contract, you have a contractual requirement to mimic or have a digital twin of that system. So you would be performing under that contract with a system which may not have the enterprise standard security requirements that your CIO assets would have. And then last, you have test equipment, things like wave meters, microscopes, things like that, that are not typical IT systems. All right, next slide. So introducing that concept of a subsystem, here is an example where we have a red box kind of demonstrating at a high level, system view 1, DODAF level sort of system. We have information system boundary. So a boundary is pretty much an imaginary red line. So if you look at your network diagrams, you can kind of picture, all right, what's my boundary point going to be? Going back to that concept, that controlled interface, it's generally going to be a firewall that exists between you and the internet. But regardless, we're going to put everything inside a red box and say what's inside of this box is included in the information system. What is outside of the box is external to the information system. But internal to that system, we can have subsystems. So here's an example where we might have a firewall with different interfaces on it, where we can segment out the system into subsystems. And reasons we'd want to do that is to limit our risk. So the CUI is one security domain, and the specialized asset might be another security domain, and the security protection assets may be another security domain. So, and then the CRMA finally could be its own security domain. So one reason to do segmentation is if one of these devices is compromised, it limits your lateral movement. So what normally happens in an attack scenario is your system will get compromised, and then they will look to pivot inside of your network and move laterally. However, if you have segmentation, it makes it a lot more difficult for them to do that because now they have to compromise that firewall that's preventing them from moving laterally as well. And you can draw this different ways. You could also have a CUI subsystem that's provided by an external service provider that is outside of your boundary. And you just kind of go into your SSP and talk about external connections that you have. Same thing with a security protection asset. So there's not one right or wrong way to carve it. It's just key thing is going back to the whole concept of where does my data reside? Where does my data go? So with that note, going to the next slide. Security protections follow the data. So wherever that data goes, the protections must follow. So understanding where things reside, understanding how they flow throughout your system, understanding do they go out to external connections? Those are very critical things to that. Knowing that information, we are able to scope. So webinar 2 talked a lot about the different data that you have, whether things are FCI or CUI. Now this is extending that onto where that information resides. Let's categorize those assets according to that CMMC scoping that we just went through. Let's scope through each of those assets. Let's then think about, do we want to segment these things out from each other? And then do we want to apply different security rigors? So CUI assets have to do 800-171, whereas a specialized asset can do less of the security aspects to it because there's operational reasons for it. You would still want to address all the requirements, but you'd want to explain why a control was or were not implemented. If it's not implemented because it's an operational technology and it needs to be configured that way to function, that is something you just have to document and go through. But from a protection standpoint, that is a lower level of protection, and that's why we have that concept of boundaries and subsystems and different security domains with different protection requirements. So when we do that scoping, it's very important. There's not a right or wrong way to do it, and I've seen some companies do their entire enterprise as CUI assets. Some companies have done enclaves where just this enclave is CUI assets, and then the corporate network might just be FCI or level 1. And I've seen the inverse where they say, you know, the corporate environment's level 2, but we're going to enclave out these level 1 stuff that doesn't necessarily meet our requirements for level 2, and we'll enclave them into a lesser security domain. And that, again, that's just another application of that concept of security domains. And going back to that, when we look back at that CMMC scoping, it's all around the access to CUI. So if you had something that is logically or physically separated, we can bring it out of scope. If we have something that we can't logically or physically separate, but we're not intending to do CUI with it, it goes back to that concept of a CRMA, contractor risk managed asset. So all that to say that if you are able to understand and control your data flows, you can control your assessment scope. And then on the final slide for me is just going back to kind of a bonus nugget here for you. A computer accessing VDI. So the C3PO form is a collective of C3POs, authorized and in process C3POs, where there's sometimes guidance lacking of authoritative guidance. They come together with position papers to kind of say, this is how we think about it, and then they vote on it. And if it gets a majority vote, it kind of comes through. So one typical example with that is if you had a virtual desktop infrastructure where you have those virtual desktops where you kind of lock down all your CUI processing is occurring centrally. It's not processing locally on those devices. Well, those devices that access VDI, some would argue, is actually visually displaying the graphical representation of CUI when it comes down to your screen. And as you know, the refresh rate on that monitor goes, it keeps refreshing that screen. So you're not actually storing any CUI on that device. You are transmitting it because you're receiving it on that device where you're getting your keyboard, video, mouse. You might be typing in CUI commands into it. The processing again occurs internally on that server. But there is a debate around whether the actual computer that's used in that virtual desktop environment where you can't copy paste, you can't download to that computer, you can't click and drag. And their position that they came up with is it's not going to be a CUI asset. Well, technically in memory, there is some level of CUI in the RAM, but we're going to consider that a contractor risk managed asset. So you still have to have some security things around that. And then the things that would be evaluated during assessment is these things that are they're bulleted here. So that is your last little nugget there on that and some of the concepts of subnetting, segmentation, and enclaves. So I'm going to hand it over to Heather now. Thanks, everyone.
I would choose an enclave, and we'll look at just some different examples. These are all things that we have seen in the industry and clients that we've worked with where someone may choose to use an enclave versus trying to segment a larger environment. One of the best reasons, and we'll take as our first example, let's say you have a small organization, 10 to 15 users, maybe up to 50, with limited IT resources, particularly if you are outsourcing your IT functions to a managed service provider. We know that one of the things that's coming is that managed service provider, with the way the rules stand right now, is written, that managed service provider is going to be required to certify under CMMC. That could potentially pose a problem. One of the things that we can look at doing is choosing an enclave where we have that IT service provider or that managed service provider handling the basic things for us, but then we can put the more secure functions within an enclave. So let's take in this example, we've got an organization that's doing just maybe some consulting and support to DoD agencies. Maybe they have a few commercial contracts, but really the bulk of their resources and their mission is in supporting DoD. I live in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. We have lots and lots of companies like this down here, where they perform a very specific function. They support a very specific entity within the DoD. And maybe they've got their managed service provider who is helping them with things like managing accounts, configuring workstations. As Jeff mentioned, some of those things, if we can keep a workstation out of scope for an environment, that's going to limit the scope dramatically. For many of these companies, they have a pretty limited IT budget. And so they want to put their resources into creating an environment that has a shared security responsibility, and it lessens the burden and the responsibility of that managed service provider. Jeff talked, prior, and I think we have some other webinars where we've talked about limiting scope. One of the things that you can also do within an enclave is you can limit the number of users. So let's say that I have a small group within my organization of people who work specifically with the DoD. Maybe they're contracts people, maybe they're program managers, maybe they're very specially, they have some sort of very specialized technical skill that the DoD hires us for. We can also then limit our CUI data in a very precise way to just those people within the organization that need to see and work with CUI. And we can keep that then out of scope for things like accounting, human resources. One of the things that is a takeaway as we're talking about all of this, and this is one of the things that we advise our clients on, is when you're making these decisions, you have to really understand what that means from an information perspective. What kind of information do you have? What are you doing with it? How is it stored, processed, or transmitted? And what you may find is, in some cases, an enclave is a great choice. You may also find that an enclave is not such a great choice, particularly if you've got some manufacturing assets, as Jeff mentioned. Those are those specialized assets. Depending on your business workflow and how you use those assets, an enclave might not be a great choice. So it's really important to understand the business functions that we're talking about. What are the things that make your company money when we're considering whether we should choose an enclave or whether we should create some segmentation? As Jeff also mentioned, we're not just talking about technology, we're also talking about people, right? And as I just said, you can potentially limit then people who need to be within the enclave working with CUI, separating those people from the people who are handling more general administrative responsibilities. One of the good things about having these discussions and as far as why you would choose an enclave is it can really force some discussions within the organization about what are the business processes, again, that are part of our mission. What do we do? How do we protect that information? Another example that would be a little more similar to example number 2, which we'll talk about in a second, would be a university, right, that does research. I've worked with many universities, and this is primarily how they do this. They create a research enclave, and then they allow in the people who are participating in that research and the people who need access to it, while eliminating the larger university network from scope for compliance. I think we've talked in prior webinars about creating a shared responsibility matrix and understanding your shared security responsibility. Choosing an enclave, especially for a smaller organization, is something that can then lessen the burden and responsibility of the managed service provider. There are lots and lots of MSPs out there who don't have a good handle on CMMC. They have no intention of going through the certification process. And if you were to ask, you know, there's such a mixed bag of the services that are provided. When you hire a managed service provider, the services that you're getting are fairly inconsistent across different MSPs. That's why it's important to understand what's in your contracts, know what you're getting, and then having that understanding can then help you decide if an enclave is the right choice. So looking at example number 2, this is another situation where an enclave might be the best choice. If you've got a large organization, you know, let's say 20,000 users, maybe it's some sort of multinational or a conglomerate. They've got multiple business segments. Maybe they have a foreign-owned parent. I have a couple of clients like this right now. They're providing, let's say, just as an example, manufacturing and support to both commercial and government entities. Perhaps they have a small percentage of information that they get that's export controlled. And so that information, again, we know export controlled information is a subset of CUI, but it comes with its own set of protections. So we're going to need to pay attention to that and understand what that means in terms of how the data live or where the data lives and how it's processed. So in this situation, rather than creating an environment as we would with a small to mid-sized organization where we're sharing security responsibilities and we're lessening the burden on our external third parties. In this case, we're separating protected information from the rest of the environment. It doesn't necessarily make sense for a larger organization like this to try to blanket apply the NIST 800-171 controls across the entire organization, particularly if they are foreign owned. Once you get into some of these larger organizations, we have to look at a lot of different compliance regulations. We have to look at how the needs of one business unit might impact others in a way that's either desirable or undesirable. And, you know, we know all of us that we don't have unlimited resources for security. So in this case, we can use the enclave to really reduce the scope, separate the protected information from the rest of the environment, and then that allows the organization to apply different levels of data protection. As an example, maybe on our enclave, we have a much higher, more stringent level of log data monitoring. We're feeding it into a SIM, but we're looking for more events than we might be in the rest of the organization. In both of these cases, an enclave can allow us to keep those regular business workflows, like accounting and personnel management, out of scope for CMMC certification. But again, for that to be the outcome, the enclave, we really have to have a good understanding of not only the business processes, but the risk. We have to take a look at, on the broader scale, what are some of the other compliance mandates that we might need to comply with, particularly if we're talking about a foreign-owned company. Is there GDPR? What about, you know, where the information is housed? So these are all things that we can look at. In the next slide, we're going to start to talk a little bit more about how we would make these determinations. So again, when we're looking at choosing an enclave, remember our previous webinar discussions. It is absolutely critical that we understand what our contract requirements are. It's also very important that we start to look at the type of data that we have, whether it's marked or not. How do we handle data that might be part of a government contract that's not marked? Understanding those different data types For the most part, we're seeing markings come through as CUI or we're seeing export controlled markings. We're generally not seeing those CUI subcategories yet, but we also have to look at the different types of data outside of the data being just CUI. Is it personally identifiable information? Is it protected health information? Do we have some kind of financial data that we might need to handle in a different way? Maybe your organization takes credit cards and you have PCI. Or some kind of HIPAA compliance requirements. So understanding data types is not just looking at CUI and saying, yes, we have CUI or no, we don't. One important question I think comes up a lot with my clients is when we talk about data that they're getting on government contracts that's unmarked, how do they handle that data? You know, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. You can say, anything we get on any government contract, we're going to consider it as CUI. We're going to treat it as CUI. It's within this protected enclave. Another strategy might be to go back and ask the government if you get some type of data and it's not marked, to go back and ask what the appropriate marking is for that. But you have to have an understanding of the data types, and you have to have kind of made that decision when you're deciding whether an enclave is the right choice for you or whether you want to proceed with some sort of segmentation. Mapping your data flows and business processes. Jeff talked a little bit about this. This is really just understanding where your information is stored, processed, or transmitted. So when we do a business process mapping, the first thing we ask is, how do you get data from the government? Is it a push situation or is it a pull situation? Are you reaching out to the government? They're emailing it to you, where they're pushing it down, or are you going out to a website and you're pulling it down off of a different location? Once we understand how that information is within the organization, we're going to then understand how it moves around, right? Do I have, one or two people that are handling it, or does everyone in the organization need to touch it? If we need to share it with external partners, who are those partners? How do we share it with? How do our third parties like cloud service providers, other services that we might be using come into play? How do they access that information? When it's stored, what are some of the requirements for that information? Do we have other storage requirements, that might be levied by, let's say I have a commercial client who requires me to encrypt all my data. These are all things that are an important part of considering whether to choose an enclave. And as Jeff said, and I said it as well, remember, it's not just technology that's potentially in scope, it's people, and it's also these processes. You've heard me talk a little bit throughout this about the pros and the cons. We're not going to sit here and tell you that an enclave is the perfect solution for anyone and everyone. They can limit operational impedance. For example, encryption required might not work well in an operational environment. If you've got a manufacturing environment, that might be something that's a little bit more difficult depending on how the data gets from the government onto the manufacturing or shop floor. I think the biggest thing to think about here is some of those things that your users are doing, particularly if you're moving them into an enclave, might feel like a little bit more of a restriction than it would if we're doing it on a process-based way. So for example, as Jeff mentioned, when you've got a VDI, you're not going to be able to pull information down to your desktop or work on it locally. It has to stay within the enclave. I have one client who their users insist that they need to be connected to home printers. And so therefore, unless they're willing to change that approach, an enclave is not going to be the right source for them, because then you're eliminating the benefit of the enclave being sort of a closed scope there. So just remember some of the pros and cons. We can really limit the cost and the time during the remediation, the management. We can reduce our scope pretty dramatically. We can outsource some of the security to organizations that have a very good understanding of NIST 800-171, whereas your managed service provider may not have that good of an understanding, particularly when it comes to meeting the spirit of the controls. But if you're going to enclave, you have to be willing to change some of these processes to fit the approach. As we said, the information has to stay within. And so that may be something where if you're not willing or you're unable to change a business process, particularly if it's something that's fairly dramatic, then an enclave might not be the best choice. On the next slide, we'll go ahead and we'll discuss a little bit about how your approach impacts your responsibility. One of the things that I think is very important to remember when you're working with an assessor, and Jeff mentioned this a little bit too, you have the ability to choose the assessor that you work with. And not everyone is going to be the right fit. So there are some questions that you're going to want to ask about how that assessor is going to approach the assessment. The thing that's important here is your assessor knows absolutely nothing about your environment. So it's really up to you to tell the story. And that starts with understanding your own mission, understanding where your data flows, how that moves around your supporting infrastructure, and then the security and control measures that you have implemented. But really, when you're introducing an assessor to your organization, it starts with that story. It starts with them understanding what your mission is and what type of data you have. If you don't have the ability to tell that story, it's going to be much more difficult. I have clients all the time come to me and they say that they've generated an SPRS score and they don't have a system security plan. And the question is always, well, how did you decide what was in scope and within the boundary for determining if this control was implemented? And it's very tempting when you get something that looks like a checklist. You know, we know that NIST 800-171 is not a checklist, but it kind of plays one on TV. You can look at it and you jump right in with 3.1.1 and you start looking at access control and you say, yeah, we're doing that. But then as you get deeper into the controls, it becomes much more difficult. And this is where a lot of organizations fall down if they haven't done the first part in terms of understanding what their mission is and what their business processes are. So your approach to this is really dramatically going to impact your responsibility, and the story that you put together and the story that you're able to tell the assessor is also going to help alleviate the level of pain that you're going through during those compliance audits. Every environment needs a shared responsibility matrix, whether or not you use an enclave. I'm a big believer in this. The shared responsibility matrix is impacted by the level of support and services provided by any external service providers you have. If by some, off chance you're not using a single other external service provider, I think it's still very important to have a shared responsibility matrix just within your own organization, understanding who within the organization is responsible for things. We see this a lot, particularly when we work with universities and certain types of organizations. They really love a RACI matrix, which is the responsible, accountable, consent, and inform. That can work for some organizations, but for some organizations that are smaller, it feels very overwhelming to be putting that matrix together. So whatever you use, whatever it looks like, it needs to be something that works for you. Remember, external service providers are not just managed service providers. It can be MSPs, it can be MSSPs, it can be a cloud that you're storing data in. It could be an accountant potentially that you're using, providing external services to the organization. Anything that you outsource responsibility for has to be contractually supported. And so when we're looking at all of these different controls, if one of these external service providers plays any role whatsoever in making sure that that control is implemented and that you're using that control the way it's intended to protect the confidentiality of data, it has to be written down somewhere who's responsible for it. Because if I'm an auditor, I'm going to come in and I'm going to ask that question. Remember, I don't know anything about your organization. And so just because we have an IT person over here, I'm not going to make the assumption that that IT person is responsible for implementing every control. Anything you outsource responsibility for has to be contractually supported. And I would encourage you, when you're looking at your contracts with your managed service providers, with your external service providers, look and see what they're actually doing. Ask the question of whether a shared responsibility matrix already exists or whether you need to work with that provider to create one. As you go through and as we all get closer to these assessment processes, remember, every control has an owner, it has a process, and it has an execution. And these are going to be very important when you actually get down to um, going through the audit. The assessors are going to not only look at your system security plan, they're going to look at your risk assessment. How you make the decision to implement a control should be based on that risk assessment. It should be based on your data flow. So again, this, to kind of summarize, right, today we're talking about why you would choose an enclave potentially over segmentation. And I think we've hit on that pretty well. But when you start to look overall, what does this compliance assessment actually look like? You still have the story that you have to tell. And as you tell that story, you need to have a good reason for why you've made the decisions that you've made. The assessors are going to look at all of these things, and the better story you can tell, the smoother your audit is going to be, and the less painful. Next slide. So I'll kick it back over. I think, Derek, you're going to take this one and talk about some of the resources that are available out there.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Jeff, too. Before we get to the Q&A, yes. So as promised, we want to try to provide as many free resources as possible. So the first two you see here are just some direct links to guides and publications that will just help take everything that's been talked about today and put a little bit more detail on it. So it's not information that's just being made up by anybody, but look there, look at the NIST 1-18 guide. Really does have some good details in there that you can help, as Heather was just kind of saying, you know, write it, document it, walk yourself through how it's being done. And the NIST 100-37 is also another good one. But one thing we wanted to throw in here as well in that graphic, and we'll have more information on this so we can send out along with the slides, is there are some really good training curriculum out there that if you're somebody at your company who is championing this internally, or you have a team of people that are trying to figure out kind of how and where and what that should happen. There is this really cool program that we are a part of, that we are trying to connect to the right audiences. And so you can see that down here, contact number for a gentleman named Gavin Walker and his team, where it doesn't cost anything. It just costs your time. And these are topics that even if it's something that you feel really good grip on, and if you've got the time to make sure that you understand where things are today, as Jeff mentioned, some things might change as time goes on for sure. But having those baseline, having the understandings, if you want to start getting some courses and some certifications in place, this program is really well laid out, but also because it's also being funded, which is a nice thing to have. So we'll put more information on that. If you want it, let us know. But that is a really good place to start for this topic. And we can go to the next slide and kind of talk about what happens from here as we move through the back half of this series before we get to live Q&A. And again, the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window will help with us being able to capture those questions. We will be sending out the previous two webinar questions along with this one. Any questions that we didn't get to that were submitted, or any questions that were submitted after the fact. We did get a couple prior to as well. We'll want to make sure that we answer those with the same idea that we reference where those answers are. So it's not just our answer. So, but into the next series here, in the next episode of the series, we were doing these in order on purpose, right? So we started with the past, present, future of CMMC. So everybody that's maybe new to the conversation or have to dust off their CMMC understanding, understands where things are at. And then we got into what Jeff and Heather both talked about last time when we had Paul on, was specifically around the data. If you don't have a grip on the data, you don't have an understanding of where your applicability is and where it isn't, your contracts, et cetera, really, really hard to make decisions, which an outcome becomes passing an assessment. So then today really starts to frame up that thought on what can I do? What can we do? What are we capable of? What are we not capable of? Do we want more business with the DoD, DHS, and others that will have these requirements in their contracts, requirements eventually? Or is it something that we want to just, do what we can now, see where it goes, et cetera? And then that's going to move into webinar number 4, which is going to be on the shared responsibility matrix. And there's still more to do than just buying and turning on and managing technology. So that's going to ramp up into what a lot of people want to know more about, which is a good conversation, is what makes you audit ready. Like, what does it mean to be ready for a CMMC assessment? Today's conversation, the last conversation, the next conversation, if that's not clear and that's not fully understood and that's done incorrectly, that assessment's not going to potentially go very well. And so we want to make sure that we are providing as much as we can there. So what you can do between now and a webinar number 4 is think about what was discussed today, rewatch this webinar and the recording, and talk about in your head or with your team on what tools and applications that you use day to day, and then start to figure out which of those answers also fit into where your CUI and CDI and applicable data might be stored, used, processed, etc., and where it's not. That starts the conversation on whether things like segmenting and then into an enclave actually can happen and not disrupt your workflows or not. And who manages it is one thing, who installed it's another thing, who and what, just start going through that. Heather did a great comment. There was some things look like a checklist, but they're not, but they are a guide. So use the guide, do what you can. And when you start to make a list, and if you can think the responsible party, person, place, thing, technology, etc., using NIST 171A, which is that assessment guide that Heather referenced, you get a pretty good idea of whether you can answer this stuff or not. Because the audit side of it, when it comes down to the day where you're asked the questions, starts with who's responsible for what. And if it's your responsibility as an organization based on what you have in your documentation, then you need to know, can we explain it? Does the person who's responsible know how to explain it? Can they show it? Has that been identified? And that's where you start to put the RACI model into place, which is what assessors really want to see. And it sounds daunting. It sounds like a lot, but that's kind of where that conversation comes into play of what your options are. And if it is daunting, then maybe looking at ways in which we can, which you can outsource that responsibility. You can't outsource everything. So that's one common myth, that you can just buy a bunch of stuff and it'll go away. That's not the case. That's not a good maturity practice anyway. So that's where we want the mindset to be for next time. We'll have that date of that event coming up here very soon. But these are homework items, and hopefully these have been helpful and can get you motivated into the right conversations. And some of it takes change. I will say the big thing that we see a lot of in the last 6 months is resource allocation. So a lot of people are building plans, they're going through these exercises, they're going through this stuff internally or with consultants like Heather and others. And then, it comes down to executing that, and a lot of questions on if can this plan work? What are we missing? Those are good conversations. Those are great details to have in place on, are we missing something? And that's good. That's where we want people's heads to be. So from a question that was submitted prior, I want to make sure we have a few minutes here to do some Q&A. So keep submitting them, please, if you can. There was a question around, I'm not going to necessarily single out manufacturers here, but if Heather or Jeff want to answer on the enclave approach, and if you have any real life examples of approaches of enclaves that you like, that you've seen. Now, you don't have to name anybody. You don't have to sit here and go on trial and say this is the way to go, but like some don't, right? There's the word enclave gets thrown around a little bit, but manufacturing or not, people who have this, I want to separate this data out. They have that mindset. They understand they can do it without disrupting flow. Heather, you can go first if you want here. Any real life examples of approaches of enclaves that really stick out?
Sure. I think, if you want to talk specifically about manufacturing, that can be one of the more tricky environments, but one that can also really benefit from an enclave. So, we had a client who had everything, basically a flat network. And what they did was they started to take a look at what business processes were actually receiving CUI and how they get that data over to the shop floor. what they ultimately ended up doing, for better or for worse, and maybe Jeff and I can debate this one a little bit, but they created an enclave for them to receive the data. When they would get the data in, then they would do what they needed to do to prepare it for the shop floor. They would put it on a thumb drive and they would sneaker net it over there, which technically doesn't break the enclave, right? Because remember, we're talking about people, processes, and technology. So now we have a process that's within scope, as well as the people that are within scope. And then they're taking it from this protected enclave over to the shop floor, which is also isolated. So the shop floor was not connected to, it had no internet connection. It's basically, here's these machines that are connected to each other so that we can manufacture the part. So that would be an example of how an enclave works. But, if we think of an enclave in a situation like that, it's not necessarily what we would say clean, right? It's not, everything is within this technically controlled bubble. They had to have a way to get data out and bring it into the manufacturing environment. And so they did that with a process.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that quick, that I think that's one of the misconceptions on the term enclave, is that it's so locked down that it can't do anything in it. And that's true in some cases, but that's not the point. The point is it's just restricting where data can go through, whether, like Jeff said, whether it's through policy and administrative privileges and stuff. But the idea is, yeah, it is in we'll call it a jail cell. It's in something where that's where it's supposed to be, and it's not just allowed to walk away. And we did see a huge seismic shift in the industry. I think everybody saw this with the pandemic. So a lot of remote, a lot of shared tools, collaboration tools, and I've got MFA on it. It's got encryption, so it's fine. I think one of the questions that got answered already live was, what happens if I'm working with a subcontractor, or I have a 1099 that comes into my environment, or I'm sharing stuff with them. Yeah, some of that falls out of your jurisdiction from what you can be responsible for, but at the same time, this is down the supply chain, is who are you working with? Are they able to handle that data? You don't want to be part of that flow down that had a link in the chain break because the right questions weren't asked or the right sharing capabilities were done incorrectly. So enclaves don't mean a physical box is locked and thrown to the bottom of the ocean type of approach. There are enclaves that allow, like Heather, I think you said right away too, is those authorized users. If you don't need to be in there, then you shouldn't be in there. And that's where you have to start. And if some people say, hey, I can't do my job without access to this information, they need to become an authorized user. And as Jeff said, that becomes a person who is now in scope that needs to be labeled, trained, etc. Going from there. Jeff, anything to elaborate on that? I've got one more question. I want to make sure I get in here with the last couple minutes left here.
No, that's pretty good. So like tying some of the stuff, regardless if you're going to do an enclave or not, you're probably going to want to do some sort of network segmentation, at least, even if it's not a formal enclave. The other thing I didn't mention, or I kind of alluded to, is that an enclave can be on-premise, it can be non-cloud, it can be cloud-based, it can be MSP-based. There's multiple varieties of enclaves that you can set up. And to your point, when you take things out, whether it's sneakernet on a thumb drive, whether it's printing, whatever it is, that's a limited and authorized process that's limited to certain people following least privilege and least functionality, which is in line with CMMC requirements.
Well, you just hit on something that actually flows really well into the question that actually really flows it well into the next webinar. So and I'm going to come back to that, because the question is, when it comes down to responsibility. So this came down to, how do I know what should be in a responsibility matrix and what shouldn't, essentially is what they're asking. But between my managed service provider, in this case, I think it was a cloud service provider, and how the limit of access and knowing that's what we're going to talk about next time. So it's a great question. We don't have to spend a ton of time on that, but I do want to highlight something that Jeff said, because I think it's a fun topic to talk about with enclaves, is that, we had a client a couple of years ago that used us and a couple of our partners they wanted to build a cloud enclave on-prem. And the way that they restricted the access, it's company policy, is that they have an enclave where you can only access it by going to that location, basically is what it was. It wasn't to build it so only certain people across the country can get into it. It was, their company's pretty big. And they just said, for these projects, that are in this system, it is going to reside in a government cloud, but you don't get to access it unless you come here and work on these devices. So they physically have to drive there. A different way of keeping that scope containerized, if you will, right? And I think that to some people that sounds just like that doesn't make sense, but it was unique, it was great. But you know what? That was before the pandemic, and now things are changing, and so there are different ways to do it. I know we're a little bit at time here. I'm going to save this other question, I think, for the next webinar, because it's a good one that was submitted prior to this one. I think just jumping ahead a little bit. If there's any final words from Jeff or Heather on anything in particular that you want people to be thinking about for next time, I'll let you guys chime in there. Otherwise, we can close this one up and move on to the next one.
Let's see, a parting thought, right? So it goes back to understanding where your data is, understanding where does your data go, and then from your data scoping, your asset management of the actual data, then we can scope the applicable assets. And if we want to limit the assets on a technical, personal, facility level, we can use enclaving and segmentation to limit access to that data, to limit the assessment scope that we're going to be looking at. And there is not necessarily a right or wrong way of doing any of this. It's all up to you. Heather did a really good job looking at some pros and cons. And then those two free resources that I added in there, they're federal centric, but they give you at least the government mindset around these concepts. So you can take that mindset and look at your environment and go, am I going to have one SSP for everything? Am I going to have a SSP for my CUI on this program? Am I going to have a separate program that has CUI? Am I going to treat each of my contracts as their own system? Am I going to have one mega system? However you want to structure it, there's not a right or wrong way. The more things you include into a system security plan, the more complex it gets, and just more things you have to prove out versus it doesn't really change things. It's just an administrative carving out, because you still got to do those things, whether it's one SSP or multiple SSPs. When you have the multiple SSPs, then you can get more into using your RACI chart to figure out who's maintaining that SSP, and do you have a different team maintaining a different SSP? So when you look at the people involved in the supporting and the maintenance of those things, that can be a good guide for how am I going to carve out different systems and SSPs as one. But if you have really small team, you're not going to carve anything out. If you're a 10-person company, you're not going to have 5 SSPs, right? You're just going to have your one SSP. You're going to have your processes built around your particular environment, your particular complexities that you're working with. And then one note to add is that the operational technology, your manufacturing equipment can have CUI on it. As it exists in current CMMC world, there's a lot of leeway in the implementation of security requirements on those. So you have a lot of flexibility and things that you don't necessarily do. Government has their eye on it. In the future, years from now, they're going to want to add more security to it, but that's a long way away. I'll let Heather have her last thoughts.
Yep, just one. I'm sort of the anti-auditor, anti-checklist. I want you to look at this from the perspective of what's the actual risk to your environment and your risk to the data. And that will help you make good decisions versus getting so embroiled in, this checklist mentality. So that's my takeaway. If segmenting and enclaving, particularly enclaving, makes that easier in terms of managing your risk, then that's definitely something to consider.
Awesome. Well, great. I'm gonna kick it back over to ATI, and thanks everybody for attending today.
Hey, thank you, Derek, Jeff, and Heather, and thank you everyone for attending. And we look forward to seeing you again next month for session 4.